Hi, this is Mrs. Nikki. Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology. Let's get right into Chapter 1. So here we have the definition of anatomy. We're going to look at anatomy and physiology, basic definitions, and then subdivisions. So anatomy is the study of structure of body parts and their relationship to one another. There are several subdivisions. When they say gross anatomy or macro, they mean large scale. So gross anatomy would be a cadaver dissection. Microscopic would be if we're going to look at cells that make up tissue underneath the microscope to get a better look at them. That's microscopic anatomy. And then developmental anatomy is if you're studying the growth of an embryo. So we won't talk about developmental or embryology until we get to the second half of anatomy and physiology. But basically, if you're going to study anatomy, you have to know the terminology and you have to be able to observe, manipulate, palpate, and do auscultation. That's basically a fancy word for stethoscope use, right? To listen to the sounds of fluid as it's moving through the body, either air or blood, to touch something, to see something. So these are the basic tools that we're going to have to understand in order to understand anatomy and practice anatomy. So the next slide here we have physiology. This is how we study the function of the body parts. You have to understand the anatomy part in order to understand how the anatomy is contributing to the physiology. And we'll have some examples later on that we can point to directly. There are subdivisions in physiology based on the organ systems. We're going to look at 11 of these organ systems in just a moment, but think of, okay, your cardiovascular, so your heart and blood pumping through your blood vessels. That is a system or a subdivision of physiology. It behaves in a certain way, and we study cardiovascular, renal, lymphatic. We may not know what these terms are yet, but we do know that there are several different physicians with many different specialties that relate to the physiology or working of the body. We're going to have to go back and study some chemical principles. We're going to have to talk about some basic physical principles as well as to how currents move, how ions move. So the next chapter we're going to cover some chemistry. Don't be too alarmed. We're going to learn just what we need to learn in order for some of these physiological functions of the body to make sense. So this principle of complementarity basically is saying that anatomy and physiology are inseparable. You can look at the anatomy of an organ and not understand how it works. You can look at a heart and see the chambers and see the vessels that lead in and out of the heart, but that doesn't tell you electrically how the heart is stimulated to pump blood. That would be the physiology part. But the tricky part is, in order for me to explain the physiology, you have to understand the anatomy or the structure, and they usually go hand in hand. So when we learn different tissue types, you'll realize that, okay, epithelial tissue usually absorbs and secretes or offers some sort of protection, so you're going to find that particular tissue type wherever you find those traits. So you'll see throughout the course how anatomy and physiology work together and that you can't really have one without the other. So here in this slide we see levels of structural organization. So the human body obviously is organized. We're going to start at the smallest chemical level and we're going to move all the way to the whole organism. So I have these highlighted in red. You do need to know the order of these structures. You have to understand not only the order but what they mean. So the smallest level of organization that we have is chemical. We have atoms and we have molecules that come together. We'll talk about this in more detail in Chapter 2. Cellular, now we're talking about the cells and their organelles. So I'll underline the word organelle because I want to make sure that you understand that organelles are compartments inside of cells. Next level we have up is tissue, then we have organs, then we have organ systems, then we have organisms. So maybe this picture will help a little bit more in your book. Shows you the figure at the chemical level. You see the atoms. Atoms come together and make molecules. Water is a molecule. Carbon dioxide is a molecule. These molecules then organize. We have organelles, and those organelles are inside cells. And then if we have several types of cells coming together, that forms tissue. And if we have several types of tissue coming together, that forms an organ. And then we have an organ system, and then we have an organism. So maybe this visual representation will help you a little bit more, but make sure that you can order these. If there was a test question about starting with the smallest or least complex level, What would that be? Chemical up to the organismal level, and that you have an idea what each of these mean. What is chemical? What is cellular? What is tissue? Okay, I have all of these highlighted because I think the requirements for life are pretty important, right? You have to be able to maintain a boundary. There's some sort of movement involved, responsiveness, digestion, metabolism, excretion, reproduction, and growth. I'm going to go over each of these in a little more detail. I just wanted to list them all for you so that you could see. So in preparing for the first exam, you would need to know these terms, know that they're all necessary life functions, but then be able to give me a sentence or two about each of these. So do you know maintaining boundaries is a necessary life function, or do you know what maintaining boundaries really means? Number one on our list here, maintaining a boundary. Basically, if you want to separate the internal from the external environment, your skin would be a great organismal example of this. So the entire human body is separated external versus internal via the skin. A plasma membrane is a boundary for cells. So plasma membrane surrounds cells and creates a natural boundary. Number two here, movement or contractility. So we can move two things. We can move body parts or we can move substances. If we're going to move body parts, I have the words skeletal muscle in parentheses here. So in order to move your arm or your leg, you're going to contract skeletal muscles. If we talk about substances, or sometimes people refer to them as fluid, we're going to use cardiac and smooth muscle. So obviously cardiac is around your heart, and smooth muscle would be any sort of hollow tubing. So you need both cardiac and smooth in order to pump blood through your heart and your blood vessels. So this is the figure from the book. I wanted to show you an example of what a plasma membrane is. Here is the plasma membrane, and you can see it surrounds the cell. So if I go up here to this picture, this is an animal cell. It's this whitish structure that surrounds the outside of the cell, and it separates the internal from the external environment. We'll talk more about some of these other features that are here as we move through chapter 2 and 3. Number 3 here, responsiveness, the ability to sense and respond to stimulus. So first let's talk about what's a stimulus. If I put my hand in hot water, the temperature difference, the water being hot, is the stimulus. So if I'm cold, it would be the cold temperature is the stimulus. So we have to be able to respond to these stimuli in order to adapt or have balance. We'll talk about homeostatic balance in just a little bit. So the first example we have is a withdrawal reflex. If you place your hand in hot water, the hot water is the stimulus, and the message gets sent to your brain, and you decide, I'm going to pull my hand out of the water before it hurts me. You might also want to control your breathing or respond to needs in terms of breathing. So if you're running a marathon, you want to be able to get more oxygen in, so therefore you're going to increase your breathing rate. You're going to breathe in more deeply and breathe in more oxygen. Number 4 here is digestion. So in order to survive, we have to break down ingested, and they call it food stuff. So basically we're talking about glucose, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids. We have to take large food molecules like a hamburger and break them down into their simplest components, and then use those components to build molecules for ourselves. So here's the breakdown of food stuff, and then the absorption of the simple molecules into our bloodstream so that we can use them. So this brings us to a good point that we need to talk about something called cellular respiration. I'm going to come back and talk about cellular respiration in more detail, but just to get the basics, we have to take food and we have to breathe in oxygen. So this is the food that we eat, this is the oxygen that we breathe. We're going to break it down into water, carbon dioxide, and we're going to create energy. And this is the really important part. We're going to create energy, and it's stored in something that we call ATP. So we have to consume food, so we have to have digestion. Number 5 here, metabolism, all the reactions that occur in the body. An example of a reaction was the equation that I just showed you for cellular respiration. So metabolism is any time we're breaking down large molecules in order to have smaller molecules, or if we have smaller molecules and we're putting them together to make larger molecules. Number 6 here, excretion. So sometimes we want to remove the waste. If we eat too much and we don't need to store it all as fat or carbohydrates, then we're going to excrete it. We can do this either through urine or we can do it through feces. Imagine if you didn't ever take the trash out. It would build up, it would become toxic, your house would stink. It's the same thing when we talk about the organismal level. We have to be able to get rid of the unwanted products at some point. The last two, reproduction and growth, kind of go hand in hand. I wanted to show you this picture. It's from another textbook. But reproduction is for growth and repair. But then I have growth down here separately. Some books put these two together. So we're talking about the production of offspring in reproduction, but we're also talking about growth if we want to increase the size of a body part or an organism. So let's look how these two go hand in hand here. So first we have male and we have female, and they're going to create eggs and sperm, right? So this would be reproduction. Male and female come together, they create egg and sperm separately, the egg and sperm come together, and now we have fertilization. So these two became the zygote. Zygote is another word for fertilized egg. Now this one cell, this is only one cell, it has to grow up into an adolescent and then eventually has to grow into an adult. So if we're talking just growth, we're talking increasing the size of a body part or an organism, then we're talking about mitosis. If we're talking about producing offspring, we're now talking about meiosis. Please go ahead and look in your book and look at the difference between mitosis and meiosis. Basically, mitosis, if I damage my skin cells and I need to grow new skin cells, I'm going to use mitosis. So dividing a cell, an identical cell copies itself and you have another cell identical to the original. Meiosis is when we create egg and sperm, and these are the only times in a human body that meiosis occurs. We create egg and sperm, which are half of the DNA of the original organism. And this allows for the egg and sperm to come together to create one cell. And then again, that one cell has to go through mitosis to turn into an adolescent and eventually adult organism. So here are some examples if you'd like to see in more detail. Here, this is again from another textbook. I teach general biology. So here is a cell, and this cell, if you want to follow, it has these two longer chromosomes and then it has these two shorter chromosomes. It has a total of 4 chromosomes. It doubles itself and then it splits, but yet we have at the very end the exact same configuration that we had in the beginning. So we're talking identical copy. When we look at meiosis over here, meiosis, we start with 4, 2 of each, right? And then through this long meiosis 1 and 2 process, do you notice how there's only 2 chromosomes in each of these 4? So what did we do? We had 4, and now we're down to 2 in each. So this is not an exact copy. This is having the number, or taking, they call it a diploid organism, and turning it into a haploid organism. So we need to make sure that we understand that humans are multicellular. We're made up of many different types of cells. So the individual cells have to be kept alive. So we're designed, basically these organ systems are designed to serve the cells which are doing the work for the organism. There are 11 organ systems that all work together to help maintain life. So the first one that we're going to cover is in chapter 5. It's called the integumentary, and basically this is your skin. It's a fancy word for your skin. So chapter 5, we'll talk about some of the tissues that make up the skin. We'll talk about how vitamin D is synthesized. We'll talk about pain and pressure receptors. We'll talk about sweat and oil glands. The skeletal system, this will be Unit 3. Unit 3 will talk about all of the bones that make up the axial and appendicular skeleton. We'll talk about some of the joints, or how those bones are articulated, which means come together or join together. In Unit 4, we're going to talk about skeletal muscles. So skeletal muscles allow for movement or locomotion, facial expression. They help maintain our posture. And then this is the important part. We're going to talk about how muscles generate heat and has something to do with ATP, and we'll get to that in just a moment. The nervous system is the last unit that we're going to talk about in 201. So this includes the brain and the spinal cord, which is called your central nervous system. We'll also talk about your peripheral nervous system, or the outer part, the parts that come out here on the periphery. And we'll talk about how the nervous system basically conveys messages to and from the brain. The rest of these slides are going to be everything that we're going to talk about in 202. So in the second anatomy, we will cover the endocrine system, and the endocrine system has to do with hormones. So hormones that control growth, reproduction, water, insulin or glucose storage, adrenal glands, which release adrenaline. So we'll talk more about these. Thyroid, which has something to do with metabolism. The next system is called the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system includes the heart and the blood vessels, which transport blood. So remember, go back to the cellular respiration. What do we want to take in? We want to take in oxygen. What do we want to get rid of? We want to get rid of carbon dioxide. The next is called the lymphatic system. A lot of people just identify it with the term immunity. It is called the lymphatic system, but basically it's going to pick up any sort of fluid that leaks from the blood vessels, and you're going to clean it and return it to the blood. So inside these little lymph nodes here, the lymph nodes are going to have white blood cells, which are going to attack any foreign substances within the body before it returns the blood back to the blood vessels and to the heart. Respiratory system. This seems pretty easily recognizable, right? We have our lungs. We may or may not know the word bronchus. That's these tubes here and here that lead to our lungs. We have our trachea. We'll talk about our larynx and our pharynx. Basically, we're going to bring oxygen in, remove carbon dioxide. Digestive system. This was one of our necessary life functions, right? We're going to take food in through our oral canal, sometimes called our buccal cavity, and we're going to take it into our esophagus. It's going to go into our stomach here, then into our small intestines, and then our large intestines, and then any waste that needs to be eliminated is going to be eliminated as feces. The urinary system. We have our kidneys here. We have our ureters or ureters that deliver the urine to the bladder, and then we're going to have the urethra, which is the tubing that allows the urine to be expelled from the body. We can also see here, we'll come much later and talk about acid-base balance, but basically how to control what's in your bloodstream by getting rid of it through urine if we need to. Last, we have male and female reproductive systems. So basically these are to produce offspring. So we're talking about meiosis. So the ovaries create eggs, the testes create sperm. This is the only place in the human body that meiosis occurs. So even though the 11 organ systems operate independently, they also come together to work for the entire organism. So here we have our digestive system, and we see food going in. And this outer box is supposed to be the integumentary system. So this would be us taking food into our mouth, right? So the food travels through our esophagus, into our stomach, into our intestines, and we take the nutrients out of the food and we dump it into our cardiovascular system. And our heart is going to pump that food around in our bloodstream. On the respiratory side here, we take oxygen, travels down our trachea or bronchi into our lungs, and then the oxygen is dumped into our cardiovascular system. So again, the food that we eat and the oxygen that we breathe is pumping around in our cardiovascular system to be delivered to our cells. So the cells are going to take the oxygen and the food, and they're going to undergo cellular respiration, and they're going to create ATP, and that ATP can be used to do work. So when I say cells, it could be muscle cells contracting, it could be nervous cells transmitting neural messages. Then any excess is going to come out through the urinary system. So any liquid excess is going to become urine, any solid excess is going to become feces. So you can see in this slide how all of these individual organ systems are interdependent on each other. So what are some survival needs of the body? First, we have to have the nutrients. So this is the glucose we're talking about. Most people call that whole category carbohydrates. We'll come back and talk about some of these others a little bit later. But basically, we need to take the food that we eat and we need to break it down and get energy from that food. Obviously, we need oxygen. Again, I'm bringing up cellular respiration again. You have to have food and oxygen in order to make ATP. Number 3 is water. Water is the most abundant chemical in the body. This second one is really the most important. It's the site of chemical reactions. So there are several reactions within the body that require water in order to break a really large molecule down into a smaller molecule. We'll talk about hydrolysis in just a moment. Also, water provides the medium for secretions and excretions. So if we're going to secrete something like sweat, that's mostly made up of water. Excretions, urine, fecal matter require water. You can also think of your blood flowing around in your cardiovascular system. The majority of your blood plasma is made up of water. Number 4, normal body temperature. So we haven't really talked about chemical reactions yet, but if your body temperature is too high, it can affect the rate of chemical reactions, and it can actually damage some of the enzymes that are responsible for carrying out specific tasks within the body. And then number 5 won't make a lot of sense until we come back and talk about respiratory in 202. But you have to have the appropriate atmospheric pressure. So in order for your lungs to be able to carry out gas exchange, you have to have a certain amount of pressure on lungs. And if that pressure changes, you're not going to be able to breathe in and you're not going to be able to exhale. Think about if someone is sitting on your chest, it's a lot harder to take in a deep breath and get enough oxygen. Next, we have homeostasis. The idea of homeostasis is that you have a stable internal despite what's happening outside. So inside the body is staying stable despite what's happening outside. This sometimes is called a dynamic state of equilibrium. It fluctuates around a set point, and if you lose control of your homeostatic functions, this can result in death or illness. So let's say this is our set point. Let's do body temperature. So what do we want our body temperature to be around? We want it to hover around 98.6, right? So let's say you go outside and it's 105. Maybe your body temperature will go up a little bit. Maybe it'll go up to 99. You have internal mechanisms that try to bring that body temperature back down. We call that sweating. Let's say it's cold outside and you walk outside without a jacket on. Maybe your body temperature will drop below 98.6. And then you will adjust your internal thermostat back to this set point. So they call this a dynamic state of equilibrium because can you go above and below the set point? Yes, but your body's always trying to return you to this set point. There are components of a control mechanism when we're talking about homeostasis. The first one is a receptor, then we have a control center, and then we're going to see the word effector, number 3, in just a moment. So what does the receptor do? The receptor is going to respond to some sort of stimulus and send information to the control center. So let's say you're hot. You might have a receptor in your skin, and the receptor in your skin is triggered by the fact that it's hot. That's the stimulus. And it's going to send a message to your control center. Your control center is your brain. Your brain is going to decide what to do about it. Your brain determines that set point that we've been talking about. So the effector is going to receive an output from the control center, and it's going to respond or act on the original stimulus. So here we have the receptor. Here's stimulus first. Stimulus triggers the receptor. Receptor sends a message to the control center, which is your brain. Control center sends a message to the effector, and now you're going to go back into homeostatic balance. They also call these the afferent pathway and the efferent pathway. Probably the best way to remember it is A is ascending and E is exiting. So afferent is the message going to the brain, efferent is the message coming away from the brain or exiting the brain. We have to look at two different types of homeostatic controls. There's negative feedback and then there's positive feedback. So negative feedback is going to reduce or shut off the original stimulus. Its goal is to prevent sudden and severe changes in the body. So temperature regulation that we've been talking about is one example. And then another example that the book gives is about regulating glucose by insulin. So let's look at body temperature. In this case, here's the stimulus. The stimulus on this side is going to be that you're hot. Your body temperature rises. So you're becoming hot. The receptors in your skin are going to detect the fact that it's hot. So stimulus triggers the receptor. The receptor sends a message to the control center. These are neurons. So we haven't really talked about neurons other than to talk about the nervous system. But how do we send a message from your finger to your brain? It travels on nerves, which are made up of neurons. Then the brain sends a message back out, and this time the effectors are going to be the sweat glands. So you are going to start creating sweat and releasing sweat. Sweat glands are activated. When you're sweating, you're actually drawing heat away from the body. So you are hot, so temperature was high. You start sweating, it draws heat away from the body, and you cool down. So the stimulus is ended. You're no longer triggering that you're hot because the sweat is evaporating and pulling heat away from your body. Do we see how this is a negative feedback? It was high, now it's low. Same thing if we go the opposite way in terms of shivering. So this is your body temperature falls. So your body temperature is dropping. It sends a message to the receptor. Receptor sends a message to the control center. Control center says, okay, I'm cold. What am I going to do about it? This time, the effector changes. So please pay attention that the effector changes depending on the action that we need to take place. So in this example, if you're cold, your skeletal muscles will start contracting. And we notice this as shivering. So your skeletal muscles are contracting, and when your skeletal muscles contract, they increase your body temperature. They're going to release and break down. They're going to release heat by breaking down ATP. Positive feedback is the opposite. This is a response that enhances or exaggerates the original stimulus. So in positive feedback, you have the original stimulus, and this positive feedback is going to cause a loop to increase the original stimulus. Sometimes they call this a cascade, or they call it an amplifying effect. There's a couple examples. We can look at labor contraction and we can look at blood clotting. So here's a picture from another book. Here is the baby's head pushing on the cervix. This is an example of positive feedback, right? So the baby's head is pushing on the cervix. That sends a message to the brain. So the baby's head pushing on the cervix, the baby's head is the stimulus. The receptors are in the cervix. So stimulus is the baby's head, the receptors are in the cervix. That sends a message to your control center. Then your control center says, well, what do I need to do to get the baby out? I need to release a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to be released from the brain, and it's going to cause or stimulate uterine contractions, and that's going to push the baby's head again on the cervix. So then we have this whole process over again. If the baby's head presses on the cervix, it sends a message to the brain creates oxytocin, that causes more uterine contractions. Eventually what will happen is the baby will be pushed out. So as soon as the baby leaves the vaginal canal and is now no longer pushing on the cervix, this process will stop once that happens. So this is called positive feedback. It's like you're driving a train all in one direction. Another example that we'll talk about in more detail in 202 is if you need to have clotting occur. So here we have a tear in a blood vessel wall, and you can see that the blood is coming out. There's a positive feedback cycle that's initiated where platelets, these are in our blood, these are cell fragments that are in our blood, they're going to adhere to this tear. they're going to release chemicals, and those chemicals are going to tell more platelets to come and plug up this gap or this hole. So basically, some platelets come and they cause more platelets to follow them to plug this gap in the blood vessel. Time to move on to anatomical position and terms. Most of the following information is going to be lab-based. So we have a standard anatomical position where your body is erect or upright, your face is forward, your feet are slightly apart, your arms are at your side, and your palms are facing forward, or the term that we're going to use is towards the anterior. Directional terms are going to be used, that's anterior, posterior, we'll see some more in just a second, to relate one body structure to another. Direction is always based on the anatomical position. So let's look at some of these. Superior. Superior is the top. So towards the head or the upper part of the body. So we could say, okay, your heart is superior to your thigh. For inferior, it would be the opposite. So in this case, I could say your knee is inferior compared to your head. So it's away from the head end. Anterior is going to be the front of the body, and posterior is going to be the back of the body, so towards the back. You can also use the word ventral and dorsal. You can use these interchangeably. That's fine. It's not the case. You can read down here. It's synonymous in humans, but not the case for four-legged animals. Next, we have medial. Medial will be running down the middle. So think of your spinal column, right? Your vertebral column or spinal cord, that would be something that's medial. Lateral would be the sides or the outer edge. So think of here and here. So your arms are lateral to your chest and your abdominal cavity. Your ears are lateral to your nose. Intermediate isn't used as much, but basically it's in between. So here's our arm, this is our outer shoulder, right? And let's say this is our breastbone, this is our sternum is what we're going to call it. You have a bone right here, and that bone is your clavicle or your collarbone. So we would say your collarbone is intermediate between the breastbone and the shoulder. Proximal versus distal have to do with the body trunk. So closer to the trunk is proximal, farther from the trunk is distal. So this part right here, if I was just going to look at the arm, this part of the arm is proximal. And then go down here to this part. This part of the arm would be distal. So one of the things we could say is that if a patient had a fracture right here, you wouldn't have to say they have a fracture on their upper arm closest to their chest. You could just write proximal, brachial, or proximal humerus. This bone is called the humerus. The area is called brachial. But you could say proximal humerus fracture and be done. So if you had a fracture that was lower down, then that would be distal. Superficial and deep are pretty self-explanatory. If you have something that's on the surface of your skin or the surface of an object, it's superficial. And if something's farther inside, then it's deep. We divide the body into two regions. One is called axial and one is called appendicular. So axial includes the head, the neck, and the trunk, and appendicular are your limbs or your arms and your legs. So this is a picture from your book where it's showing the anatomical position. See how the palms are facing forward, feet are apart, hands at your side, face forward. And then it gives you some regional terms. So cephalic has something to do with head. You can see some of these that are important. Brachial is arm. We use this one quite a bit. Antecubital is pretty important. This is where they take blood from, so most people know that one. Antebrachial is your forearm. Carpal is your wrist. Digital for your digits. So you can look through these terms. Mammary obviously is going to be the breast area. Auxiliary, you may not know, that's armpit area here. And so we have these for both anterior and then we have them for posterior. So this is your gluteal region. Your scapular region is where your scapula would be located, right here. So go ahead and look through these regional terms and make sure that you know them. Body planes is the next slide where we're going to look at the three most common. There's a sagittal, a frontal, or a transverse plane. If we cut the body into specific sections, you'll be able to see certain structures. So let's look at these in a little more detail. Please notice that there are additional names. If you want to say frontal or coronal, that's fine. Frontal's more correct, but we still use coronal. If you cut the crown, that's coronal. So the sagittal plane divides the body into vertical, left, and right. So if I have my little person here, and we have some better examples than this. If I have this person, if I cut right down the middle, that's a sagittal cut. It is also called a mid-sagittal. So mid-sagittal will be right down the middle. A sagittal might be slightly off to the side. It's still dividing into a right half and left half. A frontal or coronal is when you're going to divide into an anterior and posterior part. A transverse is when you're going to divide into a superior and inferior, and oblique is if you're going to cut at an angle. So here's probably a better example than my little drawing. So this is a median or mid-sagittal. So they're cutting right down the middle, and you end up with a right half and a left half. This is a frontal. So again, mid-sagittal is if you cut right down the middle, but I could also make a cut here, and that would be just sagittal. Frontal or coronal, you're going to cut the crown. So basically, you're cutting this way to where you have an anterior half and you have a posterior half. This is a transverse plane where you're cutting through the body to where you have a superior and you have an inferior half. So when you look down at these actual scans, you can see that depending on the cut or the plane, you're going to see certain organs. So in this frontal, you can see the lungs and the liver and the heart. But now we've done a transverse right here at the abdomen. So if we do a transverse at the abdomen, are we going to see the lungs and the heart? No, we would have to do a transverse cut up here if we wanted to see the lungs and the heart. Body cavities. Again, we divide the body up into dorsal cavities, which is here in gold, and then we're going to see the ventral cavities, which are in red. So these are subdivisions. So the dorsal cavity is made up of two subdivisions. One is called the cranial, and one is called the vertebral, or you can call it the spinal as well. Some people call it the spinal cavity. The ventral cavity houses your viscera, and viscera are basically organs. So the term viscera means organ. So your ventral cavity houses your viscera. So all of this is your thoracic cavity. So thoracic cavity is where you have your chest. Your abdominal pelvic is just what it says it is, abdominal and pelvic. So your abdominal pelvic is all of this area. So we can break these down even farther into smaller subcomponents, if you will. So let's go to the next slide. Your thoracic cavity has two pleural cavities, and pleural means lung. You have a mediastinum, which contains the pericardial cavity, and then inside the pericardial cavity, you have your heart. So the best way to look at this is all of this is your thoracic, but then I can break thoracic down. They've broken it down into superior mediastinum, and down here they have pericardial within the mediastinum. So all of this middle sternum or mediastinum, this includes this top section here and this bottom section, but this section down here is called pericardial. Then this is pleural and this is pleural. So basically you have thoracic, And then you break the thoracic down, you have pleural, and you also have mediastinum, and then inside the mediastinum is where you have that pericardial cavity. What's inside the pericardial cavity? This is where we find the heart. What's inside the pleural cavity? This is where you find the lungs. The abdominal pelvic cavity can be broken down into two subcavities, the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. So the pelvic cavity is going to have your bladder, your reproductive organs, and your rectum. Everything else in the abdominal cavity. So here you can see this is all of the abdominal cavity, and then this is the pelvic cavity. So it's the lower portion of the abdominal pelvic cavity. So this is a clinical or homeostatic imbalance. Question. So which area has limited protection by bone, which makes the organs in this area most vulnerable to trauma? You can see the outline of bone here. Remember, our heart and our lungs are encased in our rib cage and our sternum. We can see there's bones back here and there's our hip bones here. Do you see how this section right here, all we have is our spinal cord in the back, but in the front we don't have anything. So basically your abdominal cavity is the most vulnerable to trauma because there is no bone protecting these organs. So what organs would be in your abdominal cavity? Any of your digestive viscera. So we're talking about your large intestines, small intestines, your part of your stomach, your liver, your spleen. Next on our list is serosa. So basically within the ventral cavity, we have serous membranes. We call that serosa, plural. So it's a double-layered membrane that's separated by serous fluid. There's a parietal. So parietal lines the body wall, and visceral is going to cover the organs. It has the word viscera in it, right? Visceral serosa covers the internal organs. Both layers secrete a fluid for lubrication, and we call that fluid serous fluid. It's going to reduce the friction along the body cavities. So in this example, they try to tell you it's like taking a balloon and inserting your hand into the balloon. You'd have the inner layer that's touching your hand, you'd have a space for air, and then you'd have this outer layer. It's the same here with the heart. There's an outer layer, then there's an inner layer, and what's in between is space filled with fluid. Probably the best way to think about why we have this serous fluid, your heart is constantly beating. But remember, your lungs are right here and here, right? So your heart is constantly beating. We don't want your heart rubbing up or having friction against the lungs. When you have friction, you have heat. When you have heat, you have tissue damage. So these serous layers provide lubrication and reduce the amount of friction, especially in organs that are moving all of the time. These serous membrane layers are named after the specific cavity and the organs that they're associated with. So parietal again touches the body wall, visceral touches the internal organs. So basically we have wall, cavity wall, then we're going to have parietal membrane, then we're going to have a space, then we're going to have visceral membrane, and then we're going to have the organ. So the parietal pericardium is this outer layer, but we're telling you pericardium so that you know that it's heart. So this would be parietal pericardium. You'd have a space filled with fluid. Then you'd have the visceral pericardium, and then you'd have the heart or the organ. If I say parietal pleura, pleura means lung. So this is the outer, parietal pleura is the outer serous membrane layer that lines the internal body wall. Peritoneum is the area that lines the abdominal cavity. So parietal peritoneum is going to line the abdominal pelvic cavity wall. Visceral actually covers the organ. So we have visceral pericardium, visceral pleura, visceral peritoneum. Sometimes these serous membrane layers can become inflamed due to an infection, and it causes the smooth layers to become rough and stick together, and this can cause a lot of pain. So two examples here, I have pleurisy and peritonitis. They're telling you where this inflammation is occurring in which layers, right? Pleural means lungs, and peritonitis has to do with the abdominal cavity. The next topic we have to move on to is abdominal pelvic quadrants. So basically we have a right upper, a left upper, a right lower, and a left lower. And these are abdominal pelvic regions. So these do not go into the thoracic cavity. So you can see here, not thoracic cavity. Where do the quadrants start? They start directly below your lungs and your heart. This right here is called your diaphragm. This is the muscle that helps you breathe. That's where the quadrants start. So it's basically to help break the abdominal pelvic quadrant into 4 separate quadrants. So here's the right upper, right lower, left upper, left lower. And one of the things to pay attention to is that I'm looking at this model front, straight on. So this is the right side and this is the left side. There are 9 other divisions if you want to be more specific, and these are used by anatomists. They're used in surgery. So we can look at the 9 different quadrants if you wanted to be more specific. And here's an example of the 9 quadrants. I do not require my students to know the 9 quadrants, but you do need to know the 4 and know which organs would be in each of the 4. There are a few other body cavities. There's the nasal cavity, there's the orbital or eye, there's the middle ear cavities, and we also have synovial joint cavities that we'll talk about in Chapter 8. The last thing I want to discuss is spelling. A lot of people don't understand why we don't have multiple choice lab tests, why it's direct memory, blank lab answer sheet, and you write the answer in. It's because spelling is important. So one spelling error could misidentify a structure or a disease and cause a lot of problems. So the muscle, and we have a muscle called the trapezius, but we have a bone called trapezium. Again, we have a muscle called occipitalis, but occipital is the bone. And this one's even more alarming if you misspell it, the ilium and the ilium. One is part of your small intestine and one is your hip bone. So why does this matter? Well, let's say somebody spells something incorrectly, your nurse, and somebody goes in and takes out a piece of your hip bone when all you were going to do is have a small section of your small intestine removed. It would make a big difference to you. So I suggest you pay attention to your spelling because it will be counted off on the lab practicals. So be precise in your terms, spell correctly. It's demanded of you if you're going to enter the healthcare profession. And remember that lives are going to be in your hands.